Are you struggling to create punching sounding drums that cut through in the mix and provide that impact in your track? If so, you'll definitely want to check out this tutorial on how to layer your drums. What is up, everyone? It's Daniel here from UpstreamSquad. So in this video, we're going to talk about drum layering. The key to getting impactful drums in your mix is layering your drum samples. So drum samples today are actually really professionally polished. A lot of the samples that you can get are really layered and are really detailed and have impact and will provide your track with the necessary detail and power that it needs. Well, if the samples are already out there, then I guess this tutorial is over. No, just kidding. That is where you're wrong. Well, that's not gonna quite get you where you wanna go in your productions. So these samples today are really good. You'll still wanna know how to layer your samples because each track that you make will require you to have specific sounds that work for the specific song you're working on. So while you may use the polished sample that sounds good, when you mix your track, you still may need to layer a few other sounds to get the sound that you're after. And of course, if you want to create drum sounds from scratch from basic drum samples, then this is definitely the tutorial for you as well. So before we get into the DAW, I just want to go over the 4 factors that really make good drum layering. And those factors are 1, the timing of your samples, 2, the pitching of your samples, 3, the frequency content or characteristics of your samples, and 4, the stereo imaging of the samples. Those are the 4 factors that you'll want to consider when you're layering your drums. So as always, let's get into the DAW. So to help show you how you can layer your samples, we're going to go over 3 examples. We're going to go over the layering of kicks, claps, and percussion. But before we go into the layering of each drum sample and the processing of the drums, we're going to go ahead and play a not layered and layered drum loop so you can hear the difference that the layering we're going to do makes. So as you can hear, the layered drum loop has a lot more detail. It fills out the frequency spectrum a bit more, fills out the stereo imaging a bit more, and it's just a more complex sound. And having this detail and interest in your drum samples will add to the overall production and make it more enjoyable for the listener. So while we go over our layering of the drum samples, we're going to again be focusing on the 4 factors: the pitching, timing, frequency content and characteristic of the sound, and the stereo imaging. By manipulating some or all of these factors for your drum samples when layering is the key to creating a good mix and to creating layered sounds that sound like they are one sample. So let's first go into our kick layering. Our first layer is the main kick. As with all drum sample layering, we'll want a main layer that provides most of the weight and character to the sound. Let's have a listen to this kick. So this is a great solid kick that really comes through in the mix. And to help elevate this kick a little bit more, we decided to add a top end kick to this as well. This top end kick is providing more space to the sound and it's providing a little bit more character as well. So for this example, our main kick actually had a lot of high frequency content. It sounds like it's layered with some sort of hi-hat sample and it's providing a lot of sizzle. While I like some of this sizzle, it's a little too overpowering. So I decided to put an EQ on the kick and to roll off some of this high-end sound. It was just a little too bright, so I felt taming it was best here. Now again, the processing for these drum samples and these layers is not going to be the same for your track or for any track that I potentially work on in the future. It's going to be different for each track. It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your song, and the different layers and sounds will dictate how they should sound in your mix. So we rolled off the high end a bit with a high shelf filter to take out some of the brightness and to also let the top end kick come through a bit more. Let's have a listen to the 2 together now. So that sounds much better. It's not too much sizzle in the kick, but the low end of this kick is starting to really muddy up the mix. We already have a low kick playing, that's a solid foundation, and we don't want the frequencies of the top end kick to interfere with this main kick. So we'll go ahead and also add another EQ, and we'll just roll off the low end here. We rolled it off at around 539 hertz. So we really took out the punch of this kick and left just the high end tick and the reverb on the kick. So now let's have a listen to these two samples together. So it's sounding much more impactful, much more fully frequencied, and has much more stereo interest here. So in our kick layers, we added a main kick and a top end kick to fill out the frequency spectrum, which is one of the factors that affects layering. And we also added to the stereo image with our top end layer. So we hit 2 of the 3 factors that affect how we layer our sounds. When I combine multiple drum samples together to create one layer, I like to also add a compressor on the groups of these sounds to really glue them together and really make them sound like one sample. And to do this, we just add a small amount of compression that is taming a bit of the body of the samples. So we've added a compressor here with a 3:1 ratio and an attack at around 8 milliseconds. You'll want to adjust the attack to let the initial transient come through. This will avoid flattening out the punch of the drum. And then we had a release at around 106 milliseconds, as this gave the compressor enough time to compress the body and then release the amount of compression. So here's with the compression, and then without. So very subtle. Again, focuses on just applying a small amount of compression, adjust the attack to let the initial transient through the compressor so it doesn't compress the peak and take away the punch, and have a release so the compressor compresses the body of the samples, and then releases in time for the samples to breathe. One quick tip here for adjusting your compressor, go ahead and bring down the threshold all the way or close to all the way on your compressor, and then adjust the attack and release settings. This will help you understand exactly what is happening when you could change these controls, as each move will be exacerbated. So let's now move on to our clap sound. We have our main layer here, the clap. And I didn't apply any processing onto this clap sound, as I think it's great the way it sounds. It's a classic clap sound and works well as the foundational layering clap sample. And to play around with the sound characteristic and frequency spectrum of our layered clap samples, we're going to go ahead and add a high layer here. And I chose to use a snap. Let's have a listen. So it really has a lot of high end. It provides that interest as well as the stereo field, as it is adding information to the sides of the stereo field. So since this is our high layer, we don't want any lower frequency content interfering with our other clap layers and anything else in the mix. Again, we just want the high frequency content in this sound so we can remove the lower frequencies, which we've done with this EQ here. You can see on the EQ that there are some frequencies coming in below our 600 hertz low cut EQ here, and those simply aren't needed. So we've just done a simple EQ cut. And this is common practice for most all your high layers. You're not going to need the lower frequency content, so just remove it with a low cut EQ. And then next we have our low layer. Let's have a listen to it. And for this low layer, we actually changed around the pitching of it. This isn't the original sound. Let's have a listen to the original sound without the pitching. We pitched it down 6 semitones here. So that was the original. That was pitched down. And the reason I decided to add a lower layer is I wanted more punch and more weight to the sound, as a low layer helps support the main layer and give it that extra power. So the pitching of your elements can really play a factor in the overall quality and characteristic of your sound. My suggestion here when trying to figure out exactly where to pitch your samples is to play the samples together and just adjust the pitch of the sample. So you can just solo the entire clap group here and then just adjust the pitch. And I found the -6 semitones to add just enough power to the layered clap. And the final thing that we've done to our clap sample is adjust the timing of our low layer. Previously, this sample was moved over and the initial transient hit right on the downbeat. This brings up a very important point. When you're layering drum samples, you'll just want to have one or two samples play the initial transient on the downbeat. And you'll want to avoid cluttering up all these different transients together. If you have many different drum samples playing the initial transient at the same time, you're going to throw off the dynamics of your track. These transients will come together and create a very big peak in your sound, as there is a lot of power, and the accumulation of these different transients will cause the initial hit to be very loud, and it'll be much harder to mix in these drums, because you'll have this loud sample playing for a brief period of time, and the other sounds won't be nearly as loud. You'll also run into issues in the mastering stage if you just stack up transients. Since this sound is so loud, it'll be the first sound to hit the limiter, and your limiter will have to work really hard to compress this transient sound, and it won't allow you to get your track as loud as it can be, because this transient sound is hitting the limiter first and is much louder than the other sounds. So as you push your track up louder, the transient sound will be the first thing to distort, even when the other sounds in your track are not that loud yet and can benefit from more limiting. So the high transient drum sample keeps your song from getting as loud as it could be, as it will distort first. So what you can do to avoid this is simply adjust the timing of the samples. Have different layers play at different times, and have the transients play slightly later in the sound. Simply moving over this sound, we take away the transient from the initial hit, and let these two samples provide the initial transient hit. And once these two sounds start to fade off a little bit, we bring in the low layer and have its transient play. So again, we're avoiding stacking the transient layers. Again, one or two samples should be playing this transient layer, and the other sounds should be shifted. You can also have one of the transients play before as well, so you don't have to have the transient play after. Whatever sounds best for your song. So let's hear these layers separated and then combined. So you can hear much more impactful. And then finally, we have our group processing with some simple EQing and compression. Since we have a kick playing in the low end, we don't really need the frequency content in the low end for the clap. So we just gone ahead and rolled it off at 170 Hertz. And we'd used a steeper EQ curve here to make sure we're really cutting off those frequencies. Just think any part of the frequency spectrum that is not providing to the overall quality and characteristic of your sound, just remove. And then again, we have a compressor with a 2.2 ratio, a short attack, and a really quick release. Again, this is just to glue the sound together and make it sound like one sample playing. And we got these settings by soloing the clap and then bringing down the threshold and then adjusting our attack and release this way. So there we're letting the initial attack come through, as again, we don't want to crush the transient, and then adjusting the release. At around 37 milliseconds, it grabs the body of it and gives the compressor enough time to release its grip on the sound. And finally, we have the percussion. We have our main sound here, the tom, and really not much processing here, just cutting out a little bit of the low end as it was poking through in the mix a little bit too much. Just very subtle. And then we had our high layers. So our first layer, we actually added a clap to this. It's very faint in the background, again, just to add a little more character to the tom sound. And we've also moved it over in the stereo field, moved it over 16 to the right, just to make this sound appear wider in the mix. And next we have a Foley hit. Again, adding more character. And we've moved this to the left side of the stereo field just a little bit. And then we have another hi hit. And that's moved over in the stereo field 19 to the left. As you can see, these are brought down in volume a little bit, as these are just to provide the character. We have our main sound playing already. These high layers are just used to accent the sound. And for the group processing, we're just cutting out the low end of the sound, as the tom is already playing in this area here. So again, no need for low frequency content. So here's what the high layers sound like together. So not a real punchy sound, just a character layer here. And then again, we have our compressor that is gluing together all of these samples, these 4 samples here, to make it sound like one. Let's have a listen. And here's without our layers. And here's the whole layered loop playing again. Again, you can see that by adjusting the pitching, timing, and choosing samples that have their characteristics in the different parts of the frequency spectrum and adjusting the stereo image, you can create fuller sounds with your drum layers that come together to create an overall and more impactful mix. So that's gonna do it for this tutorial, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something and are able to apply the techniques in this video into your own productions. As again, that's the goal of these tutorials, is to help you guys with your tracks by giving you tips and techniques that you can apply to all of your tracks. If you use the drum layering techniques in one of your tracks, feel free to comment your track as well as your Instagram handle, as we'd love to hear your tracks, and we'll go ahead and pick our favorite ones and post them on the UpstreamSquad Instagram. And for more tutorials like this one, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UpstreamSquad_ and on the UpstreamSquad YouTube channel. Until next time, everyone, have fun making music and to the top.